Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Sunday Sit Down. I'm Reverend Phil Dieke, one of the pastors here on staff at White Rock. This is a little bit of a different setup. You can see if you're familiar with the Sunday Sit Down. Usually we're either in the sanctuary, or a couple times recently I've been at my home doing the Sunday Sit Down, but we're actually here in the studio at the basement of White Rock. Dexter has been busy at work putting together this studio, and so we're excited. If you were a part of Tiny Desk Theology last fall, you may have seen this setup. But we're excited to start using the studio more and more as we produce more and more content to come out. So hopefully you'll be seeing this setup more often, and we're going to try to do the Sunday Sit Down here more often. So whatever the case may be, we're glad that you're here with us on the Sunday Sit Down this morning. We do this every Sunday. It's a chance to just have a conversation before we get started with worship. So grateful that you have joined us for the conversation and to come get a little pre-warm up here for worship. So today we're talking about serving in our service, our worship gathering, and we thought it'd be a really good opportunity. Many of you know we've been raising money for the chaplains at Parkland, and so we have Krister who's joining us today. Krister is I didn't even ask you your exact title, Krister. So here I should do better homework here, but you're the director of chaplains at Parkland, is that right?
Yeah, director of spiritual care.
Director of Spiritual Care. Okay.
Yeah.
And so he's a member here at White Rock as well. And so we're grateful for him being a part of our congregation and part of our family, but also for obviously the work y'all have been doing at Parkland. And, I'm sure this has been a bit of a chaotic time, but really what I wanted to do is I wanted to hear about a little bit of your background, where you come from, give you a chance to introduce yourself to the congregation, or reintroduce yourself, right? We've not been together for many months now, and so we have new people who have joined our church, but we also just haven't seen each other. So if you want to take just a moment and give us a little bit of background of where you come from and how you got to be a chaplain.
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up in a non-denominational church community. Historically, my family has roots within the Churches of Christ and the Restoration movement. I went to Abilene Christian. Really thought that I was going to be called to congregational ministry, and through a lot of events, some different theological ideas, ended up going to seminary. Had a bit of an existential crisis in my first experience in seminary.
Amen to that.
Actually withdrew from seminary, decided to kind of like rethink my life, and then kind of came back to it again about a year later. And I think part of the ongoing, I guess I would consider it transformational work, but it felt deconstructive, felt very much kind of invited out of my tradition. And really wasn't sure where to go after I left the Churches of Christ. And
where did you go to seminary?
Bright Divinity School.
Yeah, sure. Over at TCU.
Yeah. We ended up going to a pretty wonderful little Presbyterian church when we were living in Nashville. We came back to Dallas, and since then have been going to White Rock United Methodist, and it's been a very good, I think, transition for me. I'm not interested in orthodoxy, and I'm not interested really in salvation questions, and that's what my heritage of origin is very much concerned about.
Yeah.
So I love them. I appreciate everything that I received from that tradition. I just think that sometimes we get invited out of spaces, and how I got into chaplaincy. So I'm an Enneagram 5, and I thought that I was going to become a professor. I was kind of on the track to do a PhD in like constructive theology or something like that. And I decided to sort of test God, and I did an internship at Methodist Hospital here in Dallas, and kind of figured out that like there was something different about chaplaincy that I had not experienced before. There was like so much pain and suffering, and with that, an encounter with what was real that I realized I was not encountering anywhere else in my life. And it was intoxicating. Even though I was scared to death of what was going to happen, like during an 18-hour on-call, I would almost always leave those experiences very alive, and it complicated my vision of my future. And eventually decided to do a residency. Spent a year at Children's Medical Center in Dallas, and while I was there, had my heart broken many times, working with families of children who died, and one thing led to another, and I gave up the dream of becoming a professor. Decided to kind of throw my lot into the world of chaplaincy, and while I was in that, a series of events kind of led to me taking on sort of a fellowship role where I kind of learned how to educate people in this field. And ever since then, I've been doing that. I've been an ACPE certified educator and kind of working in management within spiritual care since about 2010. So that's kind of really my story, how I got into it. I still find it quite meaningful. And I think more so, I'm not as interested in doing the day-to-day in-person care. I do think that I got burned out on that just from the grief, but I love walking with others through that process of learning how to do this work. So.
Yeah, you mentioned grief here, which we'll come back to in a second, but it seems like you didn't do your PhD, but you're having the opportunity to teach now, and kind of the melding of these two worlds together, which is pretty incredible. Mm-hmm. And I'm no expert in the Enneagram by any means, but when I think about like a 5, I think like that's probably a really good position for a 5 to be in. Not because you don't have emotions by any means, right? But because your willingness and ability to be so in depth in the deep dive of what it takes to be a chaplain. I went to Missouri State for undergrad, and I was a religious studies major. And about middle of my junior year, I started asking the question, what does one do with a religious studies major? And many of us started asking that question, to the point where they actually made us take a 1 credit hour class of careers in religious studies. And that's whenever I was introduced to a couple different chaplains, and I thought it'd be a really interesting path to pursue, and the more I explored it, I always wondered if I would be able to do it, honestly, because of the grief that comes along with it. And I'm sure we could talk a whole lot about grief. And one thing you said, though, I'm really fascinated by, was you weren't really interested in orthodoxy or these questions of salvation. And I wonder how that plays a role in you as both a chaplain, but also as an educator of chaplains. Have you made a connection there or thought through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the primary thing that really attracted me to chaplaincy was that, the great lowest common denominator within the world of the hospital is that everybody gets sick, everybody dies. That illness is no respecter of religion, and there has to be somebody in the hospital who is responsible for advocating for the spiritual and the moral and the emotional life of the patient.
Sure.
And I think that because I've always been probably more of a universalist at heart, I've never really I didn't care what team people were on. I think that I've always been drawn to orthopraxy and really wanting to do the right thing, regardless of where the person is coming from, and regardless of what their life has been up until that hospitalization. I think as it relates to being being an educator, I do think where that kind of comes out is it's not important to me that I agree with somebody's theology or their theory of practice, as long as it's believable for them. And if it's inconsistent or if it appears to be incongruent in some way, part of my role as an educator is to help point out that discrepancy, to say, this is your professed theology, this is what it looks like. How do you shorten the gap so that people actually believe your practice? And I think that's hard to do.
What better place to do that than not that everyone in the hospital is on their deathbed, but I think in hospitals more than any place, probably you start to face the reality of our very viable, or not viable, fragile. That's what I was looking for. Very fragile life. And when we come face to face with that, then we very much start to question a lot of these beliefs that we grew up with that may not hold water anymore. And so I'm sure that a lot of it, one, being a chaplain, but two, training people how to deal with people who are facing those realities and being forced into a deconstructive space on their theology as their theology isn't lining up with what they're experiencing in the real life, the orthopraxis of what's actually happening in their life. So yeah, is there anything you share about that, any experiences you've had on that, or how you approach that, maybe even as an educator?
I think I'll say a couple things. One of them is, yes, like every time somebody is hospitalized, there is a forced reorganization of one's beliefs. Whether we like to admit it or not, most of us have like what we call like a Deuteronomic theology.
Totally.
And, if I do this, then God will do this. And whatever those little contracts are that we make with the universe, they become functionally null and void as soon as we set foot into the hospital. And I think for the most part, we feel like, what did I do to deserve this? Where is God? And, I think part of there is a bit of a pulling back the curtain in that experience that chaplains have to kind of be present and to be a witness for, to see people kind of have their hopes dashed. Yeah. And in some ways, it's a helpful thing. It's a terrible way for it to happen. And thankfully, many of us don't have to experience like an illness for that process to kind of be experienced. But I think the other part of it is chaplains are often scared that a patient's experience of illness or a family's experience of a loved one's death is going to somehow like decimate their faith. So if somebody says, we're praying for a miracle, we believe that God is going to heal this person. So when families are close to losing a loved one, anxiety kind of is present for chaplains because they are scared that the family is going to lose their faith. And they will go to great lengths to sort of try to protect God and to try to protect the family in some way. And, my experience has been that faith is extremely resilient. It's one of the few things I think that is very resilient in people, that even in the worst situations, and even for families who are wanting a miracle, when their loved one dies, they find ways to make sense of that experience in ways that are very faith-filled. And so, I think that there are ways that illness and hospitalization bring about faith crises, but they also demonstrate, just how fundamental it is to our lives.
Yeah, there ends up being opportunity for meaning making, even if it comes at even more grief in the loss of this faith structure, something that has been so foundational. Maybe let's look at that. Let's take a minute here to talk a little bit about grief, because I just feel like we're so surrounded by grief. And I was a part of a conversation the other day with a conversation around race, and this woman just broke down crying in the middle of it. She's like, I don't even know why I'm crying. And I just said, like your tears are welcome here, but two, like, I feel like everyone's just on the edge of anytime there's anything significant, a significant conversation, whatever it may be. It may not even be something, so impactful as a race conversation, but we're like right at this borderline of being in tears or falling apart, or just because grief is so present right now in a way that we're not used to admitting to. Mm-hmm. And then it's compounded by the fact that often the ways that we deal with grief, or the rituals we have, or the practices we have to deal with them, have been, so taken away from us in many ways that we're at least used to, right? We still have some aspects of dealing with that, but the way we're used to have been taken away from us often, in the idea of gathering together in person. So what are you seeing with in the hospitals, and how people are dealing and coping with grief in spaces like that? And how are you then, these are two questions, but how are you then dealing with that personally and with your staff as well?
It's a good question. I would say in the hospital setting, and this is not just specific to my hospital, but I think across the board, I think most staff are doing whatever they can to avoid dealing with it. I think that because the nature of the work has been so relentless, there really has not been time especially for clinical staff, to sit back and to take stock of what they have actually been exposed to. I think everybody who goes into healthcare understands at some level that they are going to be exposed to vicarious trauma. And the last 10 months or so, maybe 11 months, have, escalated that to a pretty significant degree. I think that we're trying to address it institutionally as best we can by providing monthly space for staff just to kind of share their feelings, to talk about, to name some of those things that are happening. The things that we can't name, we can't really grieve. So, I think we're doing what we can institutionally to try to address that. Within my department, we're sort of in the same boat. We have been shorter staffed than normal. And, I think coupled with the grief is fear. And so you're dealing with an illness that nobody really understands very well. So while you're trying to provide support to staff and to families and to patients, you're also fearful, like, am I going to get this? Am I going to transmit this to my family and my loved ones? For a long period of time, especially in the beginning, there were staff at our hospital that weren't able to see their kids for months because they were quarantined. And so, I know that there are, like the need for therapy has increased pretty exponentially.
Sure.
Within my department, I think the majority of our staff have made use of those resources. We try to have monthly listening sessions for our department where we just kind of talk about what's going on for us and how we're doing emotionally.
Yeah.
I think, personally, I think that this has been, I will say that it's been difficult, but I think because my personality has not, I don't need a lot of community in order to be okay. I've done okay. I know for sure that I probably have eaten my feelings more in the last year than I have probably in any year of my life. But besides that, I make use of therapy. I have a wonderful analyst that I see every other week, and I believe in somatic therapies as well. So as soon as COVID begins to die down a bit, I'll probably be back in those other ways of taking care of my body. I do want to say one thing about the grief piece, because I think part of the grief that people are experiencing has to do with not being able to gather ritually. And I think that's a very real thing. And I think another part of the grief actually has to do with the fact that without any way to distract ourselves relationally, or in other ways, we're sort of faced with ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that is terrifying for most people. And to me, the grief and all of the mental health concerns that I think that are arising right now could actually be a positive thing. And to me, it's an invitation to kind of get to know oneself at a different level than they have before. I'm a little bit concerned that anytime people begin to experience discomfort, that we decide that that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
So, to me, it's really more a matter of how we story it. There are a lot of ways to story discomfort, and getting rid of it is the primary American way. But I don't think that that's always healthy.
No, that's a really good spin on that I haven't either considered or heard anybody say, that this is making us, like, forcing us to look at it that way. And so thank you for that perspective shift on it from me. So I appreciate that. Krister, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. I know you just got the second part of the COVID shot, so I know you're healing from that too. So we're grateful for you. One, that you've been inoculated, but two, that you've taken the time to come and do this with us. Many of you know we're supporting the chaplains at Parkland by raising money to feed them some meals. Again, just to kind of try to help boost morale as much as possible. So you can make a donation to that at wrumc.org/Parkland. And we hope that you will give. And, hopefully we're going to raise so much money that we have to keep feeding them because we know that y'all are doing just a tireless job. And so thank you for the work that you are doing. Thank you for being a part of our congregation and for the gifts that you bring to this church.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Phil.
Yeah, blessings to you, good sir. All right, everyone, take a quick break, take a breather. We'll be back in just a couple minutes with worship. Thanks for being with us today.